Hi everyone, this is your chapter 14 lecture talk about the research critique process and evidence-based appraisal. If you all have the desire in the future to move to advanced practice nursing in whichever specialty that you find yourself, you will have a whole course about evidence-based practice. We are working on that course right now as part of the new curriculum for the master's program at MTSU. And I think that course is going to be really valuable to students as they move into the FNP role. And I hope that they find it as valuable a process as Dr. Flagg and I have in developing the course. We actually combined research with theory, which has kind of evolved into an evidence-based practice model, which I think that the students will find more valuable than having the two separate courses. So today we're going to talk about the actual process of critiquing. So those of you who still need to complete that assignment can start working on that after this content. This really takes you through the process. And if you just follow your forms, your outlines, and get those done, those add actual points, whole points to your grade, which is very valuable for y'all. So let's get started. Your objectives for this chapter, we're going to talk about why are we doing research critiques, the rationale behind that. We're going to talk about the components of specifically qualitative and quantitative research critiques and why we need to look at both types. We're going to look at evidence-based practice and why it's important to look at the literature when we're looking at best practices and what does the evidence say about the practice that we're involved in. And we're going to talk about clinical decision making and how research, evidence-based practice, clinical practice guidelines play a role in our clinical decision making and how we are providing the best care for the patients. And then we'll kind of look at those guidelines, the clinical practice guidelines I just mentioned, to get a whole picture of the patient and how we can best care for them. Why are we doing the research? So we really want to see what is out there in the literature about best practices and critique the actual reports and the write-ups that we find in the literature. We know that those reports, the articles are peer reviewed. That means an expert in that field has looked at those and says, yes, this is good research and this makes sense and this adds to our body of knowledge. And doing the critique then, as I highlighted in point number 3, a mechanism to provide feedback for improvement. So all of our evidence-based practice and quality improvement initiatives are to improve our nursing care so that patients have good outcomes. Your book defines a critique as a careful judgment in which you give your opinion about the good and the bad parts of something. So with our critiques and the questions that are asked in the form that you're going to complete, it talks about, is this good research? Was the literature review that the researchers conducted adequate to say, okay, this needs to be studied and this will add to the body of knowledge in these ways, and the report should talk about that, and then the process in which they conducted the research using ethical considerations and how they arrived at their outcome, and then what was expected and what was unexpected. Your book on page 325 discusses types of critiques, and there are 9, I believe, here in the little in that paragraph. Elements of a research critique. It talks about the 8 times when critiques ranging from student critiques to critiques for research proposals are used to advance nursing. So you all are doing critiques. Practicing nurses look at articles and critique when they're looking at a quality improvement project or best practice. What can we do to make this better? Us educators look at critiques to see what's out there in the current literature, what's currently being done. We can partner with nurses that are practicing to improve outcomes for patients through research. Nurse researchers spend their time mostly doing research that advances a topic in nursing that they are passionate about. We present research at meetings, conferences, workshops. If we are doing research, we publish that in journals that help add to the body of knowledge. We can also be editors to the research publications. We can do opinion papers if we're an expert in that field. When the article is submitted for publication, we have peer reviewers who look at those and critique the process and the content to see that that is sound research and they followed the guidelines that are required for good research. And then for funding and to do more research, we also look at critiques. Elements of a research critique. We have, so a lot of the times with our quantitative studies, we look at the study purpose, the design, the literature review, the question, hypotheses expressed. We look at the sample, so our population, the data collected, what was collected, how it was collected. We look at the results and then recommendations. Within the recommendations, we look at what was expected, what was unexpected, and we talk about areas for future improvement and future study. We also look at limitation. Every study has limitations. We try to control for them. We tell the reader what those are, and so it's expected that there are limitations. We talk about if we can generalize that study to the greater population. Generalizability, again, strengthens our study, so we really want to see if we can generalize it. With qualitative research, that's not really our goal. We can generalize it to persons that have that experience or are in that group, but we can't generalize to all the population or the pop. So that's just the nature of that study. We want to develop expertise in doing critiques. So this is your first venture into critiquing articles, and you'll do this again in some fashion if you move to an advanced practice role and continue your education. And we can look at general areas of research study in nursing. There's a plethora of research websites, activities going on. Nursing is conducting research in different settings to advance the care of patients and outcomes. So for the process for doing the critique, you really want to read through the article carefully multiple times, grab your highlighter and start highlighting the main portions of that. Use your form as a guide as you read to highlight information that you'll need to put into your critique. We look at the organization of the articles. Each publication has a specific guidelines for the articles, so they all look the same if you're in that same publication. And you identify items that you're not understanding. You might need to look at definitions. You look at each step of the research process, and we look at strengths and limitations. What modifications to further studies are discussed, and how well did the study follow the expectations of an ideal study, and how well did they carry out the process that they intended to carry out. I want to say this too, there are studies that aren't sound. So not everything you read is valid and true. What do I mean by that? Some research have an agenda, and they skew their research results in the way that they want them to look. And that happens at times, which is not really ethical and a good way to look at that, but you might find that. So every study that you read is not great and perfect, and some of them are even biased, so you have to look at that too. So we have reviewers look at articles before they're published so that we can see what needs to be corrected before it's published. That is a process that goes on as well. Our major challenge, I feel, for nursing is evaluation of the statistics, because we don't really understand what the statistics is telling us, because we're not statisticians, which makes sense. But we need to say, does this seem to be appropriate? And we can always ask someone who knows a lot about statistics if that's true. If you work in a facility that is heavy into research, some are, some aren't, you will probably do some things with data collection and working on studies and research with your peers. And we can also do journal clubs if you find the time. Not right now, not in this current climate of pandemic, but as you move forward, when things settle down and we get our new normal, journal club is a great way to get into the literature, especially for topics that you're interested in. Assessing the knowledge for clinical decision making. So evidence-based practice is really what nurses need to strive to be doing, and we need to look at current knowledge. What is out there? What is currently being done? Is there a quality improvement project that can come from that? Can we change our clinical practice guidelines to meet the current needs of the population? So we're really, with evidence-based practice, we're wanting to look at the research out there and apply it the best way we can in the clinical setting to provide best outcomes for our patient. So with our research critique, then we want to have clinical experts review it, those persons that are on the, if you will, the front lines of what are we doing? Is this what you're doing? Is this the best way to do it? And look at the process critically to see how can we improve our processes and then come out the other side in a better place. And then we can do research in evidence-based practice to make that happen. When you're looking at quantitative research evidence, seems to me, and I think for most of y'all, that a quantitative study is easier to critique because it's a concrete process and that the researcher is doing, and your report or write-up flows in the same way for most of the articles. And so when we look at quantitative studies, we can see that the pattern is being followed, and the more you look at what's happening, the more you understand that, yes, this is part of the quantitative critique process, and this is how reports are written up. So with our quantitative studies, we have an introduction, the literature review, hypotheses, sampling of the population, what was the research design and methods that they used to gather data, and then statistical testing of the data that they collected, a discussion with limitations, and unexpected findings are always discussed, and how can we replicate the study, or where do we go from here? Quantitative studies use a conceptual and or theoretical framework. Most often you'll see the conceptual frameworks talked about in their reports and the articles. The theoretical framework is mostly assumed and understood what the underlying framework is. For our quantitative studies, it's a positivism and post-positivism are the two guiding theoretical frameworks that most quantitative researchers operate under, but they're not discussed in the report because there's no room for that. Someone emailed me, what theoretical framework are these studies operating under, because it's not written out and discussed. It's really applied. So not applied, it is assumed, or it's unstated, but we know they're operating in the post-positivism theoretical framework. Back when we were talking about frameworks in the beginning of the course, I added CTE Chapter 2, I believe, in one of the content areas that talks about theoretical frameworks, and that with quantitative it's post-positivism, which means that there is flaws in the world, but humans interact in their environment in a certain way, and that's really what post-positivism is. And when we look at quantitative research, the perspective is a little different with qualitative research. So this is your qualitative research evidence. So we're looking at the researcher-participant relationship, and that the researcher plays a role in obtaining the information. So we have to talk about ethics, and that the researcher puts their beliefs aside to gather the information. And the sampling data is words, not numbers, not statistics. We're looking for themes and commonalities in the population of interest. You all are not doing mixed method review. You will maybe encounter this in a graduate program, but it's really an integral process, and we're not going to really talk about mixed methods, and that it's double the work because you have basically a qualitative and a quantitative study going on at the same time, and written up in a way that justifies using a mixed methods style, but they are out there. And then evidence-based guidelines, clinical practice guidelines. We're to do that, and with quality improvement, we're going to identify the problem, look for the evidence, look at the merit, feasibility of the study. What is the evidence out there currently? We're going to summarize that evidence. How can we improve on what we're doing, and evaluate the results of a change? So with appraising evidence, we're going to look at expert opinion. Our clinical practice guidelines came from experts in what the current body of knowledge is. We're going to see what's going on within the organization and within the area of practice that you're working in. And we're looking at quality improvement and quality assurance. And when we have a clinical problem comes up, we can use our evidence-based appraisal to see where we're at. So with that evidence-based appraisal, we can use models. Your book doesn't really talk that much about modeling. It might in chapter 16, but there's a model and steps that we use to go about appraising evidence and evidence-based practice and looking for problems and quality improvements. So they're out there, but they're beyond the scope of this course. So here are your summary points about critiques. And just review your chapter and look at the questions in the back, and I'll be adding the answers to those, and that's really your basis for your next exam. This first point talked about jargon. So a lot of the articles you read it and it looks like it's Greek to you. You don't understand a word that's being said in there. And just like with this course, it's so different than anything that you've talked about before that you have to understand what the words are meaning. So that's why key terms are important in understanding the process. More summary points here, and we'll conclude this one with follow your forms for your rubric, for your critiques. Keep them coming so that we can get, you could add points to your grade, and doesn't take too much time, especially once you understand what you're looking for. If you have questions, let me know, okay? That concludes critiquing articles.